The farmland stretched flat and endless under a sky bruised purple by twilight. Dust hung in the air where the tractor had passed, settling onto rows of withered corn that hadn't seen good rain in 3 seasons. The airstrip ran perpendicular to the fields, 2,000 feet of cracked asphalt that nobody had used in commercial capacity since 2019. The bank letters sat stacked on the kitchen table inside the farmhouse, each one more urgent than the last, each one promising that the land would be seized, auctioned, redistributed to some corporate interest that would let it rot differently than its current owner was letting it rot. But every Sunday, without fail, the old farmer walked the length of that runway, removing debris, filling cracks with salvaged asphalt mix, painting the faded numbers at each end with whatever paint he could afford. His neighbors thought him mad. His daughter had stopped calling. The bank officer who delivered the final notice had asked him why he bothered, and he just looked at the sky and said nothing. That night the clouds came in low, thick as wool, pressing down on the earth with the weight of something inevitable. The farmhouse lights were off by 9. The wind picked up around 10, carrying with it the smell of rain that wouldn't come and something else, something mechanical and desperate. At 10:47 p.m. the sound arrived. Not the distant rumble of a commercial jet at cruise altitude, but the guttural roar of something big, something close, something wrong. The farmer was awake instantly. Decades of instinct firing through neural pathways that the VA said were damaged by exposure to things the government still wouldn't name. He moved to the window and saw nothing but darkness and the faint glow of his runway lights, which he'd switched on out of habit before bed, the way some men leave porch lights burning for ghosts. The radio in his study, an old aviation band receiver he'd kept from his years flying crop dusters, crackled to life with a voice he'd never forget. Any station, this is Reach 447 declaring emergency. We have critical fuel state, 0 divert options, requesting immediate assistance. The voice was controlled, but edged with something the farmer recognized from his own past, the particular species of fear that comes when the mathematics of physics stops offering favorable solutions. He grabbed his flashlight and ran outside, his boots unlaced, his heart hammering against ribs that had been broken twice in 2 different wars nobody thanked him for fighting. Above him, invisible in the soup of cloud and darkness, a Boeing KC-135 stratotanker was falling out of the sky with the slow-motion certainty of a cathedral collapsing. Its 4 turbofan engines were running on fumes and prayers, and its pilots had exactly one chance to find something flat enough to die on or miraculous enough to survive. The farmer stood at the threshold of his runway, waving his flashlight in broad arcs, and keyed the old handheld radio he'd grabbed from the study. Reach 447, I've got runway lights, heading 270, 2,000 feet, no obstacles. Come to Papa. There was a pause that lasted several lifetimes. Then the voice came back, different now, feminine, steady as bedrock. Copy. Reach 447 inbound. We're going to make this work. The farmer had no idea who was flying that aircraft. He had no idea that her name was Captain Marlowe Teague, call sign, Keeper, or that she'd been flying military tankers for 11 years after washing out of fighter training for reasons that had nothing to do with her skill and everything to do with politics she'd never understood. He didn't know that every other pilot in her squadron called her the best stick in the Air Force behind her back, but never to her face, or that her commander had tried to ground her 3 times for being too aggressive in her maneuvering during exercises. He didn't know that she'd grown up in Montana on a ranch that went bankrupt when she was 12, or that she'd learned to fly in a Cessna 150 held together with duct tape and spite, or that she'd promised her father on his deathbed that she'd never stop flying no matter who told her she couldn't. All he knew was the sound growing louder, the scream of engines pushed past their limits, the way the clouds seemed to part like stage curtains for something massive and desperate. The KC-135 broke through at 400 feet, too low, too fast, gear down but flaps not fully extended because there wasn't time, wasn't fuel, wasn't anything but this one impossible chance. Marlowe Teague had her hands locked on the yoke, her eyes scanning instruments that were all telling her variations of the same truth. This shouldn't work. Her co-pilot, a lieutenant named Hayes who'd flown with her for 6 months and trusted her with religious conviction, was calling out altitude and airspeed in a voice that never wavered. 300 feet, 160 knots. 200 feet, 150. 100 feet, 140. The main gear touched asphalt with a screech that sounded like the earth itself screaming in protest. The nose gear slammed down 2 seconds later. Marlowe deployed thrust reversers that barely responded, stood on the brakes with pressure that would leave bruises, and felt the massive aircraft shudder and groan and slow with agonizing reluctance. The runway numbers disappeared beneath them. The lights blurred past. The end of the pavement rushed forward with mathematical certainty. And then, with maybe 200 feet to spare, Reach 447 stopped, engines winding down into silence, every light on the panel glowing red or amber except the ones that had simply given up. The farmer reached the aircraft as the crew door opened. 8 people emerged, shaking, silent, touching the ground like it was holy. Marlowe Teague was the last one out, her flight suit dark with sweat, her face set in an expression somewhere between shock and fury. She looked at the farmer, at his unlaced boots and his flashlight and his runway that shouldn't exist, and something in her throat closed up. "You saved our lives," she said, and her voice cracked on the word lives in a way that made her hate herself a little. The farmer just shook his head. "Runway's always been here, you just needed it tonight." He paused, studying her face in the dim light. "You active duty," she nodded. "Air Force, tanker pilot." He smiled then, a sad thing full of memory. "Thought so, you got that look. The one that says you've been fighting for permission to do what you're already better at than anyone else." Marlowe stiffened, defensive instinct flaring, but he raised a hand. "Easy, Captain. I'm not your enemy. I'm just a man who knows what it looks like when the world doesn't want to let you fly." They stood there in the darkness, the wounded tanker behind them, the impossible runway beneath them, and something passed between them that neither would have words for if they'd tried. Hayes approached, carrying the aircraft logbook and a satellite phone that had finally found signal. "Captain, command knows we're down. They're sending recovery crews at first light. They want to know." He hesitated, glancing at the farmer. "They want to know how we found this strip. It's not on any charts." Marlowe looked at the old man, saw something in his eyes that reminded her of her father, and made a decision that would ripple forward through time in ways she couldn't predict. "Tell them," a guardian angel pointed the way. "That's all they need to know." The farmer's name was Isaac Drummond, and he'd flown A-10 Warthogs in the first Gulf War until shrapnel from a SAM had peppered his left leg and ended his career at 29. He'd come home to the family farm, married a woman who understood silence, and raised 3 children who'd all left for cities that promised futures he couldn't provide. When his wife died of cancer that the VA insisted wasn't service-connected, he'd stopped talking to most people and started talking to the sky. The runway had been his father's legacy, built in the 50s when crop dusting was profitable and the government subsidized rural infrastructure. Isaac had maintained it not because it made sense, but because some men need a purpose that transcends practicality. He brought the crew into his farmhouse and made coffee that was too strong and sandwiches that were too simple, and they ate like refugees because that's what they were. Marlowe sat at the kitchen table and studied the bank letters, reading between the lines the story of a man being erased by systems that didn't care about his service or his sacrifice. She thought about her own fights with the system, the time she'd been passed over for promotion because some colonel thought women couldn't handle the stress of combat operations, the time she'd flown missions so perfectly that her commanders had accused her of recklessness simply because they couldn't imagine competence looking like that. Hayes found her later standing outside under stars that had finally broken through the clouds. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "If word gets out about this place, about what happened here, the media's going to descend like locusts. They'll make Isaac famous for 15 minutes and then forget him. The bank will still take the farm. Hayes crossed his arms. So we don't tell them the whole story. We file a report that's technically accurate but strategically incomplete. Marlowe smiled without humor. You suggesting we lie to command, Lieutenant? I'm suggesting we protect our sources and methods, Captain. That's just good operational security. The night stretched long. The crew slept on floors and couches, exhausted beyond measure. Isaac stayed awake, sitting in his study with the aviation radio, listening to the frequencies he'd monitored for years, the voices of pilots crossing the darkness, unaware that below them a man was bearing witness to their passages. Marlowe found him there around 3 in the morning. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Adrenaline's still cooking, and I keep thinking about what could have happened." Isaac turned in his chair. "But it didn't, you made it." She sat down across from him. "Because you were here, because you maintained this runway for no logical reason. Why?" He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. "When I got shot down, well, not shot down exactly, but hit hard enough that I had to limp back to base, there was this moment where I thought I wasn't going to make it. The hydraulics were failing, the controls were mushy, and I was too far from anything friendly. But then I saw the runway, and I saw the guys on the ground waving me in, and I knew someone had prepared that space for exactly this moment. Someone had maintained that asphalt and kept those lights working and stood ready even though most days nothing happened. They'd done it because it was right, because someday someone would need it." He met her eyes. "I kept this runway for the same reason, because someday someone would need it. Turns out today was that day." Marlowe felt something shift inside her chest, some calcification around her heart beginning to crack. The Air Force doesn't think like that anymore. Everything's metrics and efficiency. If it's not generating measurable value, it gets cut. Isaac smiled. "The Air Force is made of people, Captain, and people remember what matters even when the system forgets. You'll see." She wanted to believe him but couldn't quite manage it. She'd seen too many good people chewed up by bureaucracy, too many traditions sacrificed for quarterly reports. "I hope you're right," she said, "but hope's not a strategy." He laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "No, but it's a starting point. And you strike me as someone who's good at building from starting points." They talked until dawn, sharing stories that were more confession than conversation, the way strangers sometimes do when they've survived something together. He told her about his daughter, who worked in pharmaceutical sales and hadn't visited in 4 years. She told him about her mother, who'd wanted her to be a teacher and had cried when she'd enlisted. They talked about the cost of choosing to be who you are instead of who others want you to be. And by the time the sun came up, they'd become something like friends. The recovery team arrived at 800, 3 trucks and a bus, and a colonel who looked like he'd been woken up too early. Colonel Vance had gray temples and a manner that suggested he'd stopped being impressed by anything around 1997. He surveyed the tanker, the runway, the farmhouse, and Marlowe with equal parts skepticism and annoyance. "Captain Teague, I've read your preliminary report. You want to explain to me how you found an uncharted airstrip in the middle of nowhere during zero visibility conditions?" Marlowe stood at attention, her voice level. "We picked up a civilian radio transmission offering assistance, sir. The runway lighting was visible once we descended below the cloud deck." Vance narrowed his eyes. "And the civilian who made this transmission is the property owner, sir, former Air Force pilot, A-10's Desert Storm." Vance's expression shifted slightly, some calculation happening behind his eyes. He turned to Isaac, who stood near the farmhouse porch looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Drummond, you maintain this runway yourself?" Isaac nodded. "Yes, sir." "Why?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Isaac met Vance's gaze without flinching. "Because it's mine to maintain, and because you never know when someone might need it." Vance studied him for a long moment, then turned back to Marlowe. "The Air Force owes you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Drummond. I'll make sure that's reflected in my report." It was a dismissal dressed as gratitude, and everyone heard it. The crew loaded onto the bus. Isaac shook hands with each of them, accepting their thanks with quiet grace. When Marlowe took his hand, he held it a moment longer. "You're going to do great things, Keeper. Don't let them convince you otherwise." She blinked, surprised he knew her call sign. Hayes must have mentioned it. "How do you know?" she asked. He smiled. "Because you're still fighting. The ones who quit don't look like you do." She wanted to say something profound, something worthy of the moment, but all that came out was "thank you." It seemed inadequate and entirely sufficient. The bus pulled away, kicking up dust that hung in the morning light like gold leaf suspended in amber. Isaac watched until it disappeared, then turned to survey his runway, his farm, his life that was balanced on the edge of erasure. The tanker would be disassembled and trucked out in pieces over the next week. The Air Force would pay him a modest fee for the emergency use of his property. The bank would not care. In 3 months, the foreclosure would proceed, and the land would pass to new owners who would let the runway crack and fade and return to Earth. But that was 3 months away. Today the sun was shining. Today 8 people were alive who might not have been. Today Isaac Drummond had done what he'd maintained that runway to do, and that was enough. He walked its length one more time, his boots scuffing on asphalt that had held the weight of something enormous and desperate, and he felt at peace in a way he hadn't in years. The sky above was clear, infinite, indifferent. He'd touched it once, long ago. He'd helped others touch it last night. That had to count for something. Back at McConnell Air Force Base in Kansas, Marlo Teague filed her after-action report and endured the debriefings, and submitted to the flight surgeon's evaluation that cleared her for duty with notes about stress management. Her squadron mates treated her with a mixture of awe and distance, the way people treat survivors of disasters they're afraid might be contagious. Her commander, Lieutenant Colonel Rashad, called her into his office and closed the door. "That was some flying, Teague." She stood at parade rest. "Thank you, sir. The Accident Investigation Board is going to want to know why you were so low on fuel in the first place." She'd expected this. The mission had been routine, a training exercise over the Midwest refueling fighters that were simulating long-range strikes. But the weather had turned faster than predicted, and one of the fighters had developed a fuel leak that required multiple refueling passes. Marlo had prioritized the fighter's survival over her own fuel state, a decision that was both correct and damning. "I made the call that saving the fighter was worth the risk, sir. I stand by it." Rashad leaned back in his chair. "The fighter made it back to base safely. You nearly crashed a $50 million aircraft in a cornfield. Some people are going to say you gambled and got lucky." She felt anger rising like bile but kept her voice steady. "Some people weren't in the cockpit, sir. I assessed the situation, calculated the risks, and executed the mission. That's what we're trained to do." Rashad sighed. "I know that, Teague, and between you and me, I agree with your decision. But you need to understand that there are people in this command who are looking for reasons to prove that women can't handle the pressure of these platforms. Every mistake you make, every risk you take, it gets magnified 100 times. It's not fair, but it's real." Marlo had heard variations of this speech her entire career. She was tired of it, tired of being told she had to be perfect while her male counterparts were allowed to be merely excellent. "So what are you saying, sir? That I should fly scared?" Rashad shook his head. "I'm saying you should fly smart. And I'm saying that what you did last night, finding that strip and putting that bird down in conditions that should have been impossible, that was the smartest flying I've seen in 20 years. Don't let the politics take that away from you." It was as close to encouragement as he could offer without compromising his position. She recognized the gesture and appreciated it even as she resented its necessity. The investigation took 6 weeks. The board reviewed flight data, interviewed the crew, and reconstructed the night frame by frame. They concluded that Captain Teague had exercised sound judgment throughout the emergency, and that her decision to land at the uncharted airstrip had saved 8 lives and 1 aircraft. But they also noted that her fuel management during the earlier training exercise had been optimistic, and recommended additional training and risk assessment. It was a gentle reprimand wrapped in commendation, the institutional equivalent of patting her head while reminding her to stay in her lane. She accepted it with outward grace and inward fury. Hayes found her in the squadron bar that night, nursing a beer she wasn't really drinking. "You okay, Captain?" she shrugged. "I'm alive. The crew's alive. The jet's getting repaired. I guess that's a win." He sat down next to her. "You know what people are saying, right? They're saying you're the best pilot in the wing. They're saying if they ever get in trouble, they want you flying the bus." She smiled without warmth. "They're saying that now. Next week they'll forget, or they'll decide I'm too risky. Or they'll find some other reason to keep me exactly where I am." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "You remember what that farmer said about the runway?" She nodded. "He said he maintained it because someday someone would need it." Hayes finished his own beer. "Maybe that's what you're doing too, maintaining your skills, staying ready even when it doesn't make sense, because someday someone's going to need the best pilot in the Air Force and you're going to be there." It was a nice thought, almost nice enough to believe. But Marlowe had been in the service long enough to know that someday was a luxury most people couldn't afford. 3 months after the emergency landing, Isaac Drummond lost his farm. The auction was brief and poorly attended. A development company bought the land for 30 cents on the dollar, planning to subdivide it into lots for suburban sprawl that would probably never materialize. Isaac packed what he could fit in his truck and moved to a veteran's home 2 counties over, a place that smelled like industrial cleanser and defeat. His daughter sent a check and a card that said she was sorry she couldn't help more. He didn't cash the check. Pride, the VA counselor told him, was a luxury he couldn't afford. He disagreed but didn't argue. Marlowe heard about it through Hayes, who'd been tracking news from the region out of curiosity. "The strip where we landed, it's gone. Well, not gone yet, but it's going to be. New owners are planning to pave it over for roads." She felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And Isaac, veteran's home, not a great situation from what I can find." She stood up from her desk. "I need to make some calls." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Captain, we can't." "I'm not asking for permission, Hayes. I'm telling you I'm making calls." She started with the local veterans organizations, then moved up to state representatives, then to the Air Force's own public affairs office. She framed it carefully, not as a personal crusade, but as a story the Air Force should want to tell. Veteran maintains runway for decades, saves Air Force crew, loses everything. It was a narrative that hit every button the service liked to press when it was looking for good publicity. The public affairs officer, a major named Torrens who had the smooth manner of someone who'd never seen combat, listened politely and promised to look into it. Marlowe knew what that meant. She pushed harder. She wrote to the Air Force Times, carefully avoiding classified details but emphasizing the human elements. She contacted the local news stations near Isaac's farm, feeding them enough information to make the story attractive without compromising operational security. She called in favors from former instructors and academy classmates, building a quiet network of pressure that pushed from multiple directions. It took 4 months, but eventually the story broke. Air Force veteran loses farm after saving crew ran in the Air Force Times with a photo of Isaac standing next to his runway. The Associated Press picked it up, then CNN, then, inevitably, Fox and MSNBC, each spinning it through their preferred ideological filters. The attention was sudden and overwhelming. Isaac found himself fielding calls from reporters, veterans advocates, and strangers who wanted to help or condemn or simply bear witness. The development company that had bought his land suddenly faced public relations pressure it hadn't anticipated. The Air Force, sensing an opportunity for positive coverage, announced it was exploring options to preserve the runway as a historical site. Politicians issued statements about honoring veterans. Checks arrived in the mail from people Isaac had never met, amounts ranging from $5 to $5,000. It was too much, too late, and exactly what Marlowe had hoped for. She visited him 6 months after the landing, driving 8 hours from base to the veteran's home where he'd been living. He'd aged in ways that had nothing to do with time, his face more lined, his eyes more distant. But when he saw her in the common room, something sparked back to life. "Keep her," he said, and it sounded like welcome home. They sat in uncomfortable chairs surrounded by other veterans who watched TV without seeing it, and she told him what she'd done, what was happening, how the momentum was building. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded in his lap like he was praying or just trying to hold something together. "You didn't have to do this," he said when she finished. She met his eyes. "Yes, I did. You saved my life and the lives of my crew. The system tried to forget that. I couldn't let it." He smiled then, sad and grateful and tired. "The runway's probably gone by now. The development company had permits." "Maybe," she said, "but you're not gone, and the story's not gone, and sometimes that's enough to change what happens next." He wanted to believe her. She could see it in his face. The war between hope and experience. The same war she fought with herself every time she strapped into a cockpit. The Air Force did preserve the runway, eventually. It took another year of negotiations, bureaucratic maneuvering, and the kind of institutional face-saving that large organizations excel at. They designated it as an auxiliary training field, claiming it had strategic value for emergency procedures training. They hired Isaac as a consultant, paying him a modest salary to maintain the facility he'd been maintaining for free. They erected a small plaque at the threshold that read Drummond Field, dedicated to the service of those who maintain the watch. It was less than he deserved and more than he'd expected. Marlowe flew the dedication ceremony, bringing a KC-135 in for a flyover that rattled windows 3 miles away. She landed afterwards, taxiing to the same spot where she'd stopped that desperate night, and when she climbed out of the cockpit, Isaac was waiting. They didn't say much. Some things don't need words. The assembled crowd of local officials, Air Force brass and media representatives applauded politely, and then it was over, and everyone went home, and the runway remained, a scar of asphalt across land that wanted to forget it. But Marlowe Teague never forgot. She kept flying, kept fighting the small wars that women in the military fight every day, the battles over respect and recognition, and the right to fail occasionally without it being attributed to gender. She made major, then lieutenant colonel, accumulating promotions at a rate that was slightly slower than her male peers but faster than most female officers. She trained younger pilots, passing on not just technical skills but something harder to quantify: the stubborn refusal to accept limitations that others impose. Her call sign Keeper took on new dimensions. It had started as a joke during her first squadron assignment. Someone had said she was a keeper after she'd successfully landed a malfunctioning tanker during a thunderstorm. But after the night at Drummond Field, it became something more. She was a keeper of standards, of tradition, of the idea that competence transcended politics. She kept the faith when others lost it. She kept flying when others quit. She kept Isaac's story alive, telling it to her students as a parable about preparedness and purpose, and the way small acts of maintenance can become large acts of salvation. Years accumulated like flight hours, each one adding to a total that meant something different to different people. To the Air Force, she was a solid officer with an exemplary record and minor notes about being difficult to manage. To her peers, she was either inspiration or threat depending on their own insecurities. To her students, she was legend wrapped in flight suit, the pilot who'd done the impossible and made it look routine. To herself, she was still just someone trying to do the job right while navigating systems that weren't designed for her success. Isaac died on a Tuesday in March, quietly and without drama, the way men of his generation often do. Heart attack, the veteran's home reported. Quick and relatively painless. No family present, though his daughter was notified and said she'd try to make it to the funeral. Marlowe got the news from Hayes, who'd kept track of Isaac out of loyalty to a story they'd both lived through. She requested leave and drove the 8 hours again, this time for a purpose she wished wasn't necessary. The funeral was small. A handful of veterans from the home, a representative from the local VFW, an Air Force chaplain who hadn't known Isaac but read from a script about service and sacrifice. Marlowe wore her dress uniform, the ribbons on her chest telling a story that Isaac would have appreciated but never asked about. She stood at attention during the ceremony, fighting the pressure behind her eyes, and when they asked if anyone wanted to speak, she stepped forward. Isaac Drummond maintained a runway for 30 years, she began, her voice carrying across the small chapel. He did it without recognition, without compensation, without any logical reason. He did it because he believed that preparedness was a form of prayer, and because he knew that someday someone would need what he'd preserved. I was that someone. My crew was that someone. 8 lives were saved because one man refused to stop maintaining something the world said was obsolete. She paused, swallowing hard. The Air Force teaches us about service and sacrifice, but Isaac taught me something deeper, that maintenance is a form of love, that keeping faith with the past is how we prepare for the future, that the work we do in obscurity might be the most important work we ever do. She sat down and the chaplain concluded the service, and they buried Isaac Drummond in a veteran's cemetery under a sky that was clear and infinite and indifferent. Marlowe stayed after everyone else left, standing by the grave with her hand resting on the temporary marker. Hayes joined her eventually, not saying anything, just being present the way good co-pilots do. "He changed my life," Marlowe said finally. "He probably changed a lot of lives. Most of them we'll never know." Hayes nodded. That was his gift, doing the work that mattered without needing the recognition. They drove back separately, and Marlowe thought about legacy, about what persists after we're gone. Isaac's runway would last maybe another decade before budget cuts or changing priorities led to its abandonment. His name would fade from records, from memory, from the institutional consciousness that moved relentlessly forward. But the 8 people he'd saved would carry him forward in ways that couldn't be measured. They'd tell the story to their children. They'd fly with a little more faith that preparation matters. They'd maintain their own runways, literal or metaphorical, in honor of a man who'd shown them how. Marlowe made full colonel at 43, a milestone that would have come earlier if she'd been more politically adept or less insistent on doing things her way. She took command of a tanker wing, becoming one of the few women to hold that position, and she ran it with a mixture of technical excellence and human understanding that earned grudging respect even from those who'd predicted her failure. She thought of Isaac often, especially when making decisions about resource allocation, about what to maintain and what to cut, about how to balance efficiency with preparedness. She established a scholarship in his name, funded initially from her own savings and later from donations she solicited from the crew that had been on Reach 447 that night. The Isaac Drummond Aviation Scholarship went to young people from rural backgrounds who wanted to fly but lacked resources. It wasn't much, usually enough for flight lessons or ground school, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. The first recipient was a girl from Nebraska whose family farm had gone under during the 2020 agricultural crisis. She wrote to Marlowe after earning her private pilot's license. "Thank you for believing someone like me could do this." The Air Force changed around her, as institutions do, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. Budget cuts reduced the tanker fleet. New aircraft replaced old ones. The wars that had defined her early career ended or transformed into different kinds of conflicts. Drones became more prevalent, artificial intelligence started handling tasks that had required human judgment, and voices within the Pentagon argued that piloted aircraft were becoming obsolete. Marlowe fought these changes when they seemed wrong and adapted to them when they seemed inevitable, and always she kept flying, kept training, kept maintaining the standards that Isaac had embodied. She retired as a brigadier general after 30 years of service, a career that had exceeded her own expectations if not her ambitions. The ceremony was formal and brief, with speeches about dedication and leadership that were simultaneously true and inadequate. Her successor, a colonel named Mitchell who'd been her student 15 years earlier, gave a speech that mentioned Drummond Field and the night that had become legend. "General Teague taught us that the measure of a pilot isn't just technical skill," Mitchell said. "It's the wisdom to recognize opportunity in crisis, the courage to attempt the impossible, and the grace to honor those who make our missions possible." She learned that from a farmer who maintained a runway in obscurity. She taught it to all of us. Marlowe stood in her dress uniform one last time, accepting the flag and the accolades and the transition into whatever came next. She thought about Isaac, about whether he'd be proud or amused or simply unsurprised. She thought about all the students she'd trained, the missions she'd flown, the small wars she'd won and lost in her fight to prove that competence transcended gender. She thought about the night she'd landed a dying aircraft on an impossible runway, and how that moment had become the axis around which the rest of her life had rotated. Afterwards at the reception, Hayes found her. He'd retired 5 years earlier, was teaching high school physics in Colorado, but he'd flown in for the ceremony. "General," he said, and she corrected him. "Just Marlowe now," he smiled. "You going to visit it?" She didn't need to ask what he meant. "Maybe, probably, I don't know what I'll find there." "Does it matter?" he asked. She considered this. "No, I guess it doesn't. Some places are important because of what happened there, not because of what's there now." She drove to Drummond Field 6 months after her retirement, taking her time, stopping at roadside diners and sleeping in motels that advertised free breakfast and delivered disappointment. The countryside had changed and hadn't, the eternal paradox of rural America. Some farms were thriving with new technology and crops engineered for changing climates. Others sat abandoned, their structures collapsing into themselves like dying stars. The GPS guided her to coordinates she'd memorized years ago, and when she arrived, the runway was still there, cracked and faded but maintained. The Air Force keeping its promise even if nobody really understood why anymore. She walked its length in civilian clothes, her boots, still military issue because some habits die hard, scuffing on asphalt that had held the weight of her desperation and Isaac's faith. The farmhouse was gone, demolished or relocated, replaced by a small building that housed communications equipment and not much else. The fields around the runway had been leased to local farmers, corn and soybeans stretching toward horizons that seemed more distant than she remembered. A wind turbine turned slowly in the distance, generating power for a grid that consumed without gratitude. At the threshold, the plaque commemorating Isaac had weathered but remained legible. She traced the letters with her fingers, feeling the grooves that held his name and his service, and a truth too simple for the modern world: that someone had cared enough to maintain something for no reason except that it was right. She stood there as the sun moved across the sky, painting the asphalt gold and then orange and then purple, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not peace exactly, but completion. The sense that a circle had closed, that a story had reached not its end but a pause, a breath between movements. Her phone rang. Mitchell, her successor, calling with a question about some administrative matter that seemed urgent to him and trivial to her. She answered anyway, giving advice that he probably didn't need but appreciated. After she hung up, she took one more look at the runway, at the sky above it, at the land around it that had witnessed miracles and failures in equal measure. Then she got in her car and drove away, carrying Isaac forward in the only way that mattered, by living the lessons he'd taught without ever meaning to teach them. Years later, when people asked her about her career, about the highlights and the challenges, she often told the story of Drummond Field. She told it differently depending on the audience, more technical for pilots, more emotional for civilians, more political for those who needed to understand why representation mattered. But the core remained constant. One night, one runway, one man who'd refused to quit, one pilot who'd refused to fail. "It changed how I think about service," she'd say. "Isaac never had my rank or my recognition, but he had something more important, the faith that doing good work matters even when nobody's watching."